She didn't accuse. She questioned. And sometimes, questions are louder than accusations. When Candace Owens turned her focus toward Oprah Winfrey's elite social circle, she didn't claim crime. She claimed patterns, private gatherings, exclusive guest lists, powerful connections that never appear on record. According to Candace, it's not about what happened. It's about who keeps showing up in the same rooms. Because when influence concentrates behind closed doors, transparency disappears. And once transparency disappears, narratives get protected. Is this about conspiracy or about access? Because if Candace is right, the real story isn't scandal. It's how elite circles operate quietly while the public watches the spotlight instead of the shadows. Stay with us. Because this isn't random, it's structural. According to Candace Owens, the most powerful decisions in society are rarely made on camera. They're made in rooms most people don't even know exist. She didn't name crimes. She didn't present indictments. She asked something far more uncomfortable. Why do the same names keep appearing together behind closed doors? When she referenced Oprah Winfrey, she didn't question success. She questioned proximity. Proximity to billionaires. Proximity to political leaders. Proximity to global influencers. Because proximity creates networks, and networks create influence. Candace argues that influence doesn't need illegality to be powerful. It only needs coordination. According to her, elite circles operate on invitation-only access. Private retreats, quiet conferences, off-the-record dinners where cameras don't exist. None of that is illegal, but it's invisible. And invisibility makes people uneasy. She claims the public sees philanthropy and empowerment messaging, but behind that messaging is alignment. Alignment of narratives. Alignment of political tone. Alignment of cultural direction. Candace suggests that when enough powerful people share private space repeatedly, ideas begin to synchronize. Not because of conspiracy, because of environment. Environment shapes belief. Belief shapes messaging. Messaging shapes culture. She believes the real issue isn't wrongdoing, it's unseen coordination. And once she said that, the internet reacted instantly. Supporters called it accountability. Critics called it insinuation. But she didn't accuse. She asked questions. And questions can destabilize power more than accusations ever could. Because accusations require proof. Questions require reflection. She pointed out something else. The same social architects often reappear in major cultural shifts, when media narratives pivot, when public figures rise suddenly, when crises receive uniform framing. Coincidence? Maybe. But she says repeated coincidence becomes pattern, and pattern demands curiosity. She emphasized that this isn't about one person, it's about ecosystems. Oprah Winfrey, in this imagery narrative, represents media gravity. Gravity attracts power. Power attracts influence. Influence attracts secrecy. Not secrecy because something illegal is happening. Secrecy because exclusivity maintains mystique. Candace argues mystique is currency. The less the public sees, the more authority remains unquestioned. And that's where her criticism lands. Not at criminal acts, at concentrated influence. She asked, when influence becomes too centralized, who holds it accountable? Because philanthropy and private influence can coexist, but transparency often doesn't. She highlighted private events where no press was allowed, closed-door strategy meetings labeled thought leadership, high-level gatherings marketed as impact retreats. None of those are crimes, but they're controlled environments, and controlled environments shape narratives before the public hears them. That's her core claim. Not exposure, observation. And observation sparked backlash. Because once you question elite proximity, you question stability. People are comfortable believing influence is dispersed. They're less comfortable realizing how concentrated it might be. Candace framed her commentary carefully. She avoided direct allegations. She avoided legal insinuations. She focused on structure. Structure is harder to dismiss than scandal. Scandal can be denied. Structure requires examination. And that examination made this controversy grow. Because suddenly, the conversation wasn't about one person. It was about elite gravity. And gravity is powerful. She ended her initial remarks with a line that echoed online. Transparency shouldn't be controversial. And that's where the story shifted. From accusation to curiosity. When Candace Owens questioned the elite proximity surrounding Oprah Winfrey, she wasn't challenging legality. She was challenging opacity. And opacity is something power protects instinctively. According to Candace, elite circles don't operate through secrecy because they're hiding crimes. They operate through privacy because privacy protects coordination. Coordination protects influence. Influence protects longevity. She argues that the higher you rise in media and philanthropy, the less spontaneous your environment becomes. Rooms get smaller, guest lists get tighter, access gets filtered. Not because something illegal is happening, but because exclusivity creates efficiency. When the same powerful minds gather repeatedly, trust develops. And trust creates alignment. Alignment creates unified messaging. Unified messaging shapes public perception. Candace believes this is where scrutiny becomes uncomfortable. Because once scrutiny enters private space, the narrative can't be curated as easily. She claims that elite environments are designed to minimize unpredictability. No press, no live streams, no transcripts, just influence. And influence flows faster when it's unseen. Observers say Candace's commentary didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing, but it did highlight a reality. Power is rarely chaotic. It's organized. And organized power dislikes interruption. She asked why certain figures repeatedly appear in the same private forums before major cultural shifts. She didn't claim those shifts were engineered. She asked whether proximity shapes perspective. Perspective shapes decisions. Decisions shape messaging. Messaging shapes culture. If the same voices influence each other repeatedly, then public narratives might not be as independent as they appear. That suggestion unsettled people, not because it proved something, but because it reframed something. People often assume influence spreads organically. Candace implies influence clusters strategically, and clustering reduces randomness. She also pointed out something subtle. Elite gatherings are often described as innovation retreats or impact summits. Positive language. But positive language doesn't erase influence concentration. She says we rarely question private power because it's wrapped in philanthropy. Philanthropy disarms criticism, but philanthropy doesn't eliminate influence. Observers noticed that after her remarks, defenders emphasized achievements and charity. Critics emphasized transparency. The debate wasn't about crime, it was about comfort. Are we comfortable with power operating privately? Or do we prefer believing influence is decentralized? Candace argues decentralization is often an illusion. She believes influence gravitates towards stability, and stability prefers predictability. Predictability comes from familiarity. Familiarity comes from recurring rooms. Recurring rooms create networks. Networks create shared perspective. And shared perspective reduces friction. Reduced friction accelerates consensus. Consensus influences public direction. That's the cycle she describes. No secret islands, no criminal accusations, just structural gravity. And gravity is difficult to dispute. Because gravity isn't illegal, it's natural. Power attracts power. Influence attracts influence. But once attraction becomes concentrated, accountability becomes distant. She emphasizes that she isn't saying something is wrong, she's saying something is concentrated. And concentration without transparency creates speculation. Speculation isn't proof, but it signals discomfort. Observers believe this is why her commentary resonated, not because she exposed scandal, but because she articulated something people sense but rarely articulate, that elite circles feel smaller than they appear. She concluded this segment by saying, "Power doesn't disappear, it gathers. And once power gathers, it prefers to operate quietly. Quiet isn't criminal, but quiet reduces visibility. And reduced visibility reduces questioning." That's her concern. Not wrongdoing, opacity. And opacity is harder to defend than success. The interesting part about what Candace Owens said wasn't the names. It was the reaction. Because the second she questioned elite proximity around Oprah Winfrey, the temperature changed. Not because she accused anyone of a crime, but because she questioned access. And access is sacred in elite environments. According to observers, questioning proximity isn't the same as questioning legality. It's questioning structure, and structure protects itself. When Candace highlighted recurring private gatherings, exclusive guest lists, and repeated cross-industry appearances, she wasn't claiming wrongdoing. She was suggesting something more subtle, that power may not be as decentralized as the public believes. That suggestion alone was enough to trigger backlash. Why? Because proximity implies influence, and influence implies potential coordination. Even if nothing unethical is happening, even if everything is technically transparent. Once someone frames elite networking as structural gravity rather than coincidence, the conversation shifts. It stops being about admiration. It becomes about concentration. Observers noticed 3 types of responses almost immediately. First, dismissal. This is just normal networking. Second, defense. Like successful people naturally gather. Third, counterattack. Why is she even questioning this? That third response is the most revealing, because it suggests questioning elite rooms is itself controversial. And Candace's core argument wasn't that something illegal happened. It was that questioning should not be taboo. She framed it as accountability culture. If public figures influence culture, and culture shapes society, then transparency shouldn't feel threatening. But it did. Because proximity carries prestige, and prestige resists scrutiny. Observers believe backlash wasn't about disproving her points. It was about protecting image stability. When you question powerful networks, you introduce uncertainty. Uncertainty disrupts narrative control. Narrative control is valuable, especially for figures who symbolize empowerment, soft philanthropy, and global reach. Candace didn't attack success. She questioned invisibility. And invisibility is often what makes elite influence comfortable. Invisible influence doesn't feel oppressive. Visible influence feels powerful. Powerful influence invites accountability. That's the tension. Analysts point out that elite environments depend on reputation integrity. If the public begins associating private gatherings with strategic alignment rather than casual networking, perception shifts. And perception drives cultural legitimacy. That's why reactions escalated quickly, because the debate moved from admiration to examination, from "look how successful she is" to "how centralized is this influence?" Those are different conversations. Observers also noticed that Candace maintained composure. She didn't escalate into accusation. She stayed in structural analysis. That made it harder to dismiss her entirely. She wasn't alleging crimes. She was analyzing patterns. And patterns are harder to attack than rumors. When you question patterns, you invite discussion. But when the pattern involves powerful figures, discussion feels destabilizing, because power prefers clarity, and questioning creates ambiguity. Ambiguity makes audiences uncomfortable. Comfort is easier when influence appears organic. Discomfort arises when influence appears coordinated. Candace leaned into that discomfort. She said, "Transparency shouldn't feel like threat." And that line resonated, because it reframed backlash as fear of exposure, not exposure of wrongdoing, but exposure of concentration. She argues that powerful ecosystems are resilient, but they're also sensitive to perception. If perception shifts from inspiration to scrutiny, influence recalibrates. Observers say this is why backlash didn't attack her facts. It attacked her framing. Framing determines interpretation. Interpretation determines momentum. Momentum determines narrative dominance. Candace introduced a new frame. Elite networking isn't random, it's gravitational. And gravity clusters. Once you see clustering, you start asking who isn't invited. Who shapes the conversation before it reaches you? Who influences the influencers? That's not conspiracy, it's structural curiosity. And structural curiosity challenges comfort. That's why the reaction was so immediate. Because comfort was disrupted, not reputation destroyed, just reframed. And reframing power is always controversial. After Candace Owens questioned the elite proximity surrounding Oprah Winfrey, something interesting happened. Nothing. No dramatic rebuttal. No public confrontation. No explosive denial. Just silence. And according to analysts, silence at high levels of influence is never accidental. But here's the key distinction. Silence doesn't equal guilt. It equals strategy. Powerful figures rarely respond to structural questioning directly because direct engagement legitimizes the frame. If you respond, you validate the premise. If you ignore, you control scale. Observers say elite silence operates differently than ordinary silence. For everyday public figures, silence can feel defensive. For high-level media architects, silence signals elevation. It says, "This doesn't require response." That's not avoidance. It's positioning. When Candace questioned proximity and elite clustering, she introduced scrutiny. But scrutiny only expands if it's fed. Without reaction, narratives struggle to grow. That's why silence can be powerful. It starves momentum. However, silence also creates space for interpretation. And interpretation is unpredictable. When no clarification comes, audiences fill gaps. Some assume confidence, others assume concealment. The absence of engagement becomes part of the story. Analysts call this controlled non-engagement. It's common among high-influence figures. Responding to every question lowers perceived authority. Maintaining silence preserves status hierarchy. Candace understood this dynamic. She didn't demand immediate answers. She highlighted the pattern of non-response itself, and that reframed silence from neutral to strategic. She suggested that elite circles don't respond because they don't need to. Their influence is insulated. Media gravity protects them. Observers believe this is where the tension deepens, because when silence becomes part of the analysis, it can no longer hide behind neutrality. Silence becomes signal. But signal doesn't equal scandal. It equals calculation. In high-visibility environments, responding to structural critiques risks amplifying them. So silence becomes shield. Shielding is not admission, it's containment. Candace argues that silence is often mistaken for dignity, but sometimes it's dominance. Dominance says, we don't need to explain proximity. And that's what unsettles critics. Not wrongdoing, hierarchy. Hierarchy that determines who must respond and who doesn't. Observers also note something subtle. Elite silence often coincides with narrative redirection, new appearances, new philanthropic announcements, new interviews focusing on unrelated topics, attention shifts without confrontation. That's strategic distraction, not deception, but redirection. Redirection stabilizes brand identity. Brand identity thrives on consistency. Candace framed her critique carefully. She didn't accuse silence of hiding crimes. She accused it of protecting influence. And protecting influence isn't illegal. It's expected. But expected behavior doesn't mean it's transparent. She believes that when powerful ecosystems operate quietly, the public becomes accustomed to opacity. And once accustomed, scrutiny feels rude. But scrutiny is part of democratic culture. That's her underlying theme. Observers believe this is why her commentary resonated. It wasn't aggressive. It was analytical. She described silence as structural insulation, and insulation prevents disruption. When insulated, influence doesn't need to defend itself. It just continues operating. That continuation can look like confidence or like indifference. Interpretation depends on perspective. Candace ended this phase with a line that echoed, "Silence protects power better than denial ever could." Not because silence hides guilt, because silence preserves hierarchy, and hierarchy rarely debates. It absorbs. The controversy didn't escalate into scandal. It evolved into examination of how elite figures respond, or don't respond, to structural questioning. And that examination might be the most important part of the entire narrative, because once you notice silence as strategy, you begin noticing it everywhere. By now, the conversation isn't about accusation, it's about structure. When Candace Owens questioned elite proximity surrounding Oprah Winfrey, something else became clear. High-level networks almost never fracture publicly. And that's not coincidence. According to analysts, elite ecosystems are built on mutual insulation, not secrecy in the criminal sense, but stability in the structural sense. Stability keeps brands intact. Stability keeps partnerships smooth. Stability keeps influence predictable. When powerful figures gather in recurring private spaces, summits, retreats, invitation-only forums, they aren't just networking, they're reinforcing alignment. Alignment doesn't require conspiracy. It requires shared interest, and shared interest creates protective instinct. Observers say elite circles rarely engage in public conflict because conflict destabilizes access. Access is currency. Losing access reduces leverage. So disagreements, if they happen, are handled quietly, privately, internally. That's why fractures are rare in public view, because public fractures weaken collective power. Candace highlighted something subtle in her commentary. She didn't claim wrongdoing. She asked why elite proximity feels immune to scrutiny. And immunity often signals insulation. Insulation protects influence from unpredictable narratives. In public culture, we see rivalries explode daily. Artists clash. Politicians debate. Celebrities feud. But at the highest tier of cultural gravity, conflict is less visible. Not because everyone agrees, but because disagreement risks destabilizing the entire ecosystem. Observers describe this as mutual preservation. If you undermine one node in the network, you risk weakening adjacent nodes. An interconnected influence doesn't like instability. Candace suggested that power at that level is less about domination and more about continuity. Continuity ensures longevity. Longevity requires coordination. Coordination thrives in quiet spaces. That's why elite ecosystems look calm, even when questioned. Calm isn't always indifference. Sometimes it's structural resilience. She framed her critique around transparency. If power clusters naturally, shouldn't transparency cluster too? But transparency at high levels is selective. Selective transparency preserves mystique. Mystique preserves authority. Authority preserves influence. Observers believe this is why backlash focused more on tone than substance. Because tone can be attacked, structure is harder to dismantle. Candace's commentary targeted structure, and structures don't respond emotionally. They absorb. She argued that the public often mistakes unity for harmony, but unity can also be alignment of interest. Interest alignment discourages visible fracture, because fracture signals vulnerability. Vulnerability invites challenge, and challenge disrupts continuity. Continuity is everything in elite environments. Observers also note something else. When high-profile figures face scrutiny about proximity or networks, they rarely respond directly. Instead, they continue operating normally. Appearances continue. Projects continue. Philanthropy continues. Normalcy is a stabilizer. Normalcy tells audiences, nothing has changed. And if nothing appears changed, controversy fades. Say Candace believes this pattern deserves attention, not because it proves wrongdoing, but because it reveals how insulated influence can be. Insulated influence isn't automatically corrupt, but it is powerful, and power without visible friction can feel untouchable. That untouchability is what unsettles critics. She concluded this segment by saying, elite rooms don't collapse from outside pressure. They recalibrate quietly. That line matters, because recalibration is subtle. Subtle shifts in alignment. Subtle shifts in association. Subtle shifts in messaging. Without public fracture, observers believe this is where the story moves beyond personalities. It becomes about ecosystems. how ecosystems preserve themselves, how ecosystems resist visible division, how ecosystems prioritize continuity over confrontation. Candace didn't accuse anyone of crimes. She questioned insulation. And insulation is difficult to debate because it's not illegal. It's architectural, the architecture of power. And architecture doesn't crumble easily, it adapts. Let's close this out. At the beginning of this story, it felt explosive. Candace Owens questioned elite proximity around Oprah Winfrey, and the internet reacted instantly. But by the end of this narrative, something becomes clear. This was never about a crime. It was about influence. Because in modern culture, influence doesn't always shout. It gathers, it aligns, it stabilizes. Candace didn't accuse. She observed. She pointed to recurring private rooms, repeated guest lists, and consistent cross-industry alignment. And that observation sparked tension. Why? Because questioning influence is more disruptive than alleging scandal. Scandals can be denied. Structure must be examined. Observers say the real lesson here is about how power operates in plain sight, yet out of reach. Elite figures don't need secrecy in the dramatic sense. They need insulation. Insulation protects narrative stability. Narrative stability protects brand authority. Brand authority protects long-term influence. And long-term influence rarely fractures publicly. That's the architecture Candace highlighted. She framed elite proximity not as conspiracy, but as gravitational pull. Power attracts power, influence clusters, networks repeat, but repetition creates alignment. Alignment creates narrative consistency. Narrative consistency creates cultural direction, and cultural direction shapes public thought. None of that is illegal. None of that is inherently corrupt, but it is concentrated, and concentration makes people uneasy. Because concentration reduces randomness. It suggests intention. Observers believe the controversy deepened not because of allegations, but because of discomfort. Discomfort with the idea that influence might be more centralized than people assume. Discomfort with elite silence. Discomfort with insulation. Candace's core message wasn't something criminal happened. It was, transparency shouldn't feel threatening. That's a structural critique, not a legal one. And structural critiques are harder to silence because they don't require proof of wrongdoing. They require reflection. Reflection invites accountability. Accountability invites recalibration. And recalibration doesn't always look dramatic. It looks subtle. Subtle shifts in messaging, subtle shifts in association, subtle shifts in how proximity is perceived. Observers say what we witnessed wasn't scandal escalation. It was cultural examination. How do elite ecosystems maintain continuity? How do they avoid public fracture? How do they preserve hierarchy? And why does questioning that hierarchy trigger backlash? The backlash wasn't about disproving Candace. It was about defending comfort. Comfort in believing influence is dispersed. Comfort in believing elite networking is purely organic. Candace disrupted that comfort. She didn't demand answers. She introduced perspective. And perspective can be more powerful than exposure. Because exposure ends stories. Perspective begins them. This imagery documentary isn't about declaring guilt. It's about understanding architecture, architecture of power, architecture of silence, architecture of alignment. Once you see the architecture, you start noticing patterns everywhere. You start asking who gathers repeatedly, who speaks together, who moves in synchronized narratives, and whether synchronization is coincidence or natural clustering. The final takeaway isn't explosive, it's reflective. Influence doesn't need scandal to be powerful. It only needs proximity. And proximity, when repeated enough, becomes structure. Structure shapes culture. Culture shapes society. That's the chain. Candace didn't break it. She illuminated it. And illumination, even without accusation, can feel threatening to those comfortable in shadowed rooms. But shadow isn't crime. Shadow is insulation. The question is whether insulation benefits everyone, or only those inside the room. That's where this story leaves us, not with answers, with awareness, like subscribe and share.